That night, my husband stood in a high-rise banquet room overlooking Boston and announced our divorce like a brand new product launch. "We are moving in different directions," he declared, smiling at the beautiful young consultant beside him. He viewed me as his discarded past. What he did not know was that the secret company I had built for 5 years held the very key to the empire he was boasting about to the entire room. My name is Quinn Butler, and if there is one fundamental truth I have learned after a decade in the shadows of the Boston corporate elite, it is that a man's ego is the most expensive liability on his balance sheet. The private dining room of the Apex Tower in the Seaport District smelled of seared Wagyu beef, aged oak panels, and the sharp, metallic tang of unbridled ambition. We were on the 65th floor, suspended above a sea of glittering city lights that mirrored the cold, sparkling diamonds resting on the collarbones of the investors' wives. Blackmere Strategic Group was hosting its end-of-quarter appreciation dinner. There were exactly 68 people in the room: the executive board, managing directors, our heaviest investors, and a handful of bright-eyed junior associates who would gladly sell their souls for a seat at the long mahogany table. I sat near the center of the room, wearing a structured charcoal dress that cost more than my first car, flawlessly playing the role I had perfected over the last 8 years, the poised, sophisticated wife of the visionary founder, Everett Dane. My husband and the face of Blackmere was holding court. Everett was a man carved from charm, bespoke Italian tailoring, and an insatiable hunger for applause. He moved through the room with a glass of vintage champagne, laughing at the precise right moments, touching shoulders, making every single person feel like they were the absolute center of the universe. He was brilliant at the performance of power. I was the one who actually built the operational engine underneath his feet. But tonight was entirely about the shiny exterior. Sitting precisely 2 seats away from Everett was Laurel Voss. Laurel was officially our new growth consultant, brought in 6 months ago at a staggering retainer of $45,000 a month to optimize our leadership presence. Unofficially, she was a polished mirror designed exclusively to reflect Everett's grandest delusions back at him. She wore a sleek ivory slip dress that violated every unspoken rule of corporate evening wear. Yet she wore it with a calculated, brazen defiance. Her hair was perfectly blown out into soft waves, and she sipped her sparkling water with a serene, knowing calmness. The dinner service concluded when the waiters silently cleared the gold-rimmed porcelain plates. Everett stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and tapped it lightly with a silver dessert spoon. A crisp, high chime cut through the low hum of conversation. The chatter died down instantly. Silence rippled across the massive room. "Thank you all for being here tonight," Everett began, his voice dropping into that familiar, resonant baritone he utilized to close multi-million-dollar deals. "This quarter has been nothing short of historic for Blackmere Strategic Group. We have expanded our market share by 22%. We have secured the anchor funding for our next 2 fiscal years. But more importantly, we have evolved." He paused masterfully, looking around the room, making direct eye contact with the key investors and board members. Then, his gaze shifted slightly, bypassing me entirely to land somewhere near the elaborate floral centerpieces. "Evolution is never a comfortable process," he continued, his tone shifting from celebratory to something strangely solemn, yet undeniably rehearsed. "It requires us to shed old skin. It requires us to make hard choices about who we are and where we are going. In business, we pivot when a strategy no longer serves the ultimate vision. Life is absolutely no different." I felt a subtle, chilling shift in the room's atmosphere. A few of the older board members, men who had known us since Blackmere was just a frantic business plan spread across our tiny kitchen table 5 years ago, shifted uncomfortably in their leather seats. Everett finally looked at me. His eyes were devoid of any warmth, any shared history, any grief. They were the cold, calculating eyes of a chief executive officer looking at an outdated piece of software that was dragging down his processing speed. "It is with a profound sense of clarity that Quinn and I have decided to move in different directions," Everett announced. His voice did not waver for a fraction of a second. It amplified over the dead, silent crowd. We have reached the absolute end of our shared path, and we are proceeding with a separation. The silence in the room became absolute. It was not the respectful quiet of a corporate speech. It was the breathless, stunned paralysis of nearly 70 people witnessing a public execution. No one breathed. No forks clinked. The junior staff stared intently at their polished shoes, terrified to look up and catch his eye. But Everett was not finished. He turned his body slightly, extending a confident hand toward the woman in the ivory dress. As Black Mirror enters its most aggressive expansion phase yet, "I need a team beside me that completely aligns with the future," Everett declared, his voice rising with renewed vigor and authority. "Therefore, I am thrilled to announce that Laurel Voss will be stepping into a permanent advisory role. Laurel will accompany the next phase of growth, both for this firm and for me personally." He did not say the word affair. He did not say the word divorce. He wrapped his betrayal in suffocating corporate jargon, presenting his new mistress as a strategic acquisition and his wife as a necessary redundancy. He expected gasps. He expected tears. He expected a scene that would justify his narrative that I was unstable and unfit for his new, elevated life. I looked at Laurel. She did not blush or look away in shame. She sat up straighter, offering the room a perfectly curated, sympathetic yet profoundly triumphant smile. She had known every single word of this speech. She had likely drafted it for him, billing him $500 an hour to write the exact script of my public humiliation. She thought she had won the ultimate prize. She thought I was just the dusty foundational brick she was stepping on to reach the penthouse suite. Everyone at the table waited for the inevitable explosion. They waited for me to throw my red wine in his face, to scream, to shatter the crystal, to run crying toward the brass-trimmed elevator doors. Instead, I did absolutely nothing. I let the silence stretch for 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The heavy weight of the quiet began to suffocate the room. Everett's confident smile faltered for a fraction of an inch as my complete lack of reaction disrupted his carefully calculated performance. Slowly, deliberately, I picked up my crystal water goblet. I took a measured, calm sip. The ice clinked sharply against the glass, the only sound in the cavernous room. I lowered the glass and set it down precisely on the center of the embroidered coaster. Then, I looked straight into Everett's eyes, and I smiled. It was not a brave smile. It was not a tragic, heartbroken smile fighting back a flood of tears. It was a terrifyingly calm, razor-sharp curve of the lips. It was the smile of an apex predator watching a blind deer wander willingly into a steel trap. From the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus Thorne, our chief financial officer who had worked intimately with me on the firm's original operating models, flinch visibly. Marcus knew me. He knew that I did not react with emotion when I was attacked. I reacted with mathematics. In that fleeting second, Marcus, and perhaps 1 or 2 other hardened veterans at the table, realized exactly what that small smile meant. They recognized the cold, undeniable certainty of a woman who had already seen the opponent's entire hand and was holding all the winning cards. I did not say a single word. Words were incredibly cheap, and Everett loved nothing more than to hear himself speak. I would not give him the satisfaction of a defensive dialogue. I stood up. The heavy fabric of my dress fell perfectly into place. I picked up my leather clutch from the table, my movements smooth and completely unhurried. I did not cast a single glance at Laurel. A queen does not acknowledge a court jester when she is preparing to burn down the entire castle. I turned and walked toward the exit. The thick plush carpets absorbed the sound of my heels. The crowd parted instinctively, creating a wide, silent path for me. I felt their stares burning into my back, a potent mixture of pity, shock, and morbid curiosity. Let them look. Let them remember this exact moment when the narrative was entirely in Everett's control, because it would be the very last time he ever held the reins. I stepped out of the private dining room and walked down the long marble hallway. The air instantly felt cooler, cleaner. I reached the elevator bank and pressed the heavy brass button. The chime sounded, a sharp, clean contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I had just left behind. The polished steel doors slid open. I stepped inside the empty car and turned around. Through the narrowing gap of the closing doors, I could see the distant entrance to the dining room, still completely paralyzed by the radioactive fallout of Everett's grand announcement. As the doors sealed shut with a soft thud, shutting out the seaport skyline and the toxic world of Blackmere Strategic Group, the absolute silence returned to me. I opened my clutch and pulled out my phone. The screen cast a pale, cold light across my face in the dim elevator. I opened my secure messaging application and selected the contact for Nora Kitt. Nora had been waiting for this exact signal for over 72 hours. My thumbs moved rapidly over the glass keyboard. I did not need to explain the dinner, the arrogant speech, or the ivory slip dress. Nora only needed the green light. I typed a single, brief message. Open the file. It is time. I pressed send. The message bubble turned blue, then instantly displayed the word read. I slipped the phone back into my bag and watched the digital floor numbers descend rapidly 60, 50, 40. Everett Dane truly believed he had just fired me from my own life. He thought he was the undisputed chief executive of our reality. He had absolutely no idea that I owned the ground he was standing on, and I was about to demolish the entire building with him still inside. The descent in the elevator was silent, a stark contrast to the loud, messy history that had brought me to this exact second. Everett and I did not begin as enemies across a polished mahogany table. We began as two 24-year-olds sitting on the worn floor of a tiny walk-up apartment in Somerville, eating cold noodles out of cardboard boxes, intensely believing that we were destined to carve our names into the bedrock of the American corporate landscape. We did not want to inherit wealth or wait patiently for a slow climb up a pre-existing ladder. We wanted to build an empire of our own. We genuinely believed that our combined intellect and ruthless ambition would be enough to conquer anything. In those early days, the division of labor was as clear as it was unspoken. Everett was the magnificent, shining exterior. He had a natural, magnetic charisma that made people lean in when he spoke. He was the kind of man who could walk into a room of hostile investors with exactly $3 in his bank account and walk out with a $50,000 seed commitment just by shaking their hands and making them feel like they were part of a revolution. But a revolution cannot survive on charm alone. It requires infrastructure. It requires someone to dig the trenches, lay the steel, and turn the beautiful, hollow promises into hard, undeniable reality. That someone was always me. While Everett was at the expensive steakhouses, ordering dry-aged ribeye and pouring expensive scotch to court our first prospective clients, I was sitting alone in the dark, staring at a glaring laptop screen. I spent 18 hours a day writing every single line of the operational models for Blackmere Strategic Group. I ruthlessly tore apart and rewrote his sloppy, overly optimistic pitch proposals until they were bulletproof. I designed the client retention strategies. I scoured the internet and industry databases to find the very first 3 clients who actually agreed to sign a contract with a firm that essentially consisted of a charismatic man and a desperate woman working from a folding table. Everett, you cannot promise the client a 20% reduction in supply chain overhead by Q3 if our predictive models are not even finalized. I remember telling him one humid night in July of 2015. He had loosened his tie, pouring himself a glass of cheap red wine, grinning that reckless, intoxicating grin that used to make my heart race. Just build the model, Quinn. Make the numbers work. I will sell the dream, and you will make it real. We are an unstoppable team. And I did. I always made it real. I sacrificed my own sleep, my own independent career trajectory, and my own peace of mind to ensure that every time Everett opened his mouth to make an impossible promise, I was right there behind him to build the safety net so he would never fall. But as Blackmere Strategic Group expanded from a 2-person hustle into a multi-million-dollar juggernaut. The dynamic shifted. The company grew. The revenue streams multiplied, and the offices moved from a cramped apartment to a sleek suite in the financial district, and eventually to the high-rise tower. With every new milestone, Everett inhaled the intoxicating fumes of his own success. He became addicted to the constant, echoing applause. He loved being introduced at galas as the sole visionary. He loved the glossy magazine features that called him the solitary architect of Boston's premier consulting firm. Slowly, the word "we" evaporated from his vocabulary, entirely replaced by the word "I." I secured the merger. I developed the risk matrix. I foresaw the market downturn. He began to push me into the shadows, molding me into the role of the elegant, supportive wife who stood quietly behind the great man. I was expected to wear the right designer dresses, host the perfect charity dinners, and smile graciously while he took absolute credit for the proprietary data analysis processes that I had personally designed from the ground up. His betrayal was not a sudden, explosive event. It was not a single, shocking affair that shattered our foundation overnight. It was the slow, agonizing death of my identity by 1,000 microscopic cuts. He betrayed me every single time he interrupted me during a board meeting to explain my own ideas back to me. He betrayed me every time he dismissed my warnings about over-leveraging our assets as mere feminine anxiety. He betrayed me by treating my tireless, foundational work as a naturally occurring resource, something he was simply entitled to consume without gratitude or acknowledgement. He looked at me and no longer saw his co-founder or his equal. He saw a piece of reliable, outdated machinery that he had outgrown. Then, slightly over 14 months ago, Laurel Voss walked through the frosted glass doors of Blackmere. She did not arrive as a romantic interest. She arrived under the sophisticated, sterile guise of a growth consultant. She charged an exorbitant hourly rate and spoke entirely in polished, meaningless corporate buzzwords. She scheduled weekly private sessions with Everett to discuss brand repositioning, masculine leadership energy, and optimizing his executive presence for the post-middle-age demographic. I saw through the charade within the very first week. I reviewed her preliminary reports, and there was absolutely no hard data, no market analysis, and no tangible strategic value. Laurel Voss was not consulting a business. She was consulting his ego. She realized immediately that Everett was a man terrified of aging, terrified of losing his golden boy status, and utterly desperate for unquestioning worship. So, she sold him exactly what he wanted to buy. She sold him a brand new, highly curated version of himself. She reflected back a powerful, flawless titan of industry who did not need to answer to anyone. More importantly, she offered him a reality where I did not exist. I was the inconvenient woman who knew exactly how many times he had failed. I knew the passwords to the accounts he overdrew. I knew the panic attacks he suffered before major pitches in the early years. I knew the truth. Laurel, however, offered him a blank slate. She was a beautiful, validating mirror that erased all of his insecurities and never reminded him that he was standing on an empire built entirely by his wife. He fell for it with the predictable, embarrassing enthusiasm of a starving man at a banquet. He began echoing her empty phrases. He started changing his wardrobe, adopting a forced, aggressive posture in meetings, and actively cutting me out of all internal communications regarding the firm's future direction. He truly believed he was evolving into his ultimate form, but as I stood in the lobby of the Apex Tower, feeling the cool night air seep through the revolving glass doors, I felt no sorrow for the ghost of the boy I had loved a decade ago. The memories were not painful. They were merely data points. I had spent 8 years building Everett Dane into a giant. Now, with a quiet, icy clarity, I recognized that he had willingly handed me the sledgehammer to bring him down. He wanted to rewrite his history and erase the architect. He was about to learn a very brutal lesson about what happens when you dismantle the load-bearing pillar of your own house. I stepped out onto the damp pavement, raised my hand to hail a waiting black car, and mentally prepared to review the files Nora was already unlocking. The time for being the silent foundation was officially over. The unraveling of Everett Dane did not begin with a screaming match in our foyer or a tearful confrontation over a misplaced hotel receipt. It began exactly 4 months ago, on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, when I was routinely auditing the quarterly operating accounts for Blackmere. Despite my forced transition into the background, I still retained administrative access to the primary ledger. It was a leftover privilege from the days when I was the only person managing our payroll, one that Everett, in his supreme arrogance, had simply forgotten to revoke. I was cross-referencing vendor disbursements when a recurring line item caught my eye. The payee was listed as Voss Advisory Studio. The first invoice, dated 11 months prior, was for a relatively modest retainer of $12,500. But as I scrolled down the digital column, the figures mutated. By month 4, the wire transfers had ballooned to $28,000. By month 7, Everett was authorizing direct payments of $42,000. The most recent payout, cleared just 2 weeks ago, was a staggering $65,000. I clicked into the attached purchase orders, expecting to find comprehensive market analyses, restructuring proposals, or at the very least, a binder of raw demographic data. There was nothing. The file was a graveyard of empty attachments and single-page PDF invoices. I did not panic. I simply picked up my phone and called Nora Kitt. Nora and I had been friends since our undergraduate years at university. She was a forensic accountant by trade, a woman who possessed a naturally suspicious mind and a terrifying ability to look at a spreadsheet and read the darkest, most hidden sins of the human soul. Nora was not someone who offered warm hugs or sympathetic platitudes. If you went to Nora with a problem, she did not ask how you felt. She asked for your login credentials. For 3 consecutive nights, while Everett was conveniently out of town at a so-called leadership summit in Chicago, Nora sat at my mahogany dining table. The surface was buried under printed bank statements, highlighted email logs, and calendar exports. We operated in total silence, fueled by black coffee and a shared, surgical focus. Nora cross-referenced every single dollar that left the Blackmere operating account with Everett's private calendar. "Look at this," Nora said quietly on the 3rd night, her finger tracing a line on a highlighted printout. "He authorized a payment of $35,000 on the 12th of October. The invoice lists the service as Strategic Presence Optimization." She slid another piece of paper across the table. It was Everett's schedule for the 12th of October. "And here is his calendar for that exact same week," Nora continued, her voice flat, devoid of any inflection. He had a 4-hour lunch at the Four Seasons, followed by an afternoon blocked out for private executive alignment. No deliverables, no meeting minutes, just a massive wire transfer and a missing afternoon. We dug deeper into the invoice descriptions. They were a masterclass in sophisticated nothingness. Laurel was billing the firm exorbitant sums for leadership calibration, energetic restructuring, and paradigm realignment. It was a vocabulary designed to sound incredibly expensive while legally obligating her to produce absolutely zero tangible business results. She was siphoning corporate funds to finance their affair, and Everett was eagerly signing the checks, hiding his infidelity right in the middle of our profit and loss statements. A lesser woman might have printed the spreadsheets, driven to his office, and thrown them at his perfectly groomed face. But I knew that confronting a narcissist with partial evidence only gives them the opportunity to build a better lie. I needed a weapon much sharper than a forensic accountant. I needed a butcher. The following Monday, I walked into the austere, minimalist offices of Julian Pike. Julian was a corporate litigator renowned throughout the Eastern Seaboard for his unsettling calm. He did not yell in courtrooms. He did not pound his fists on tables. He simply dismantled his opponents with a quiet, lethal precision that left them bankrupt before they even realized they were bleeding. He specialized in untangling high-net-worth fraud disguised as legitimate corporate activity. I handed Julian a thick leather binder containing everything Nora and I had compiled. He sat behind his sleek glass desk, put on a pair of silver reading glasses, and read through the documents for 45 uninterrupted minutes. I sat perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on his wall. Finally, Julian closed the binder and folded his hands. "Your husband is not a victim of a random opportunist, Quinn," Julian said, his tone conversational, as if we were discussing the weather. "Laurel Voss is not a consultant. She is an apex predator, and she operates with a very specific, highly refined methodology." I leaned forward slightly. "Explain the methodology." Julian tapped the cover of the binder. "She hunts a distinct demographic, men in their late 40s or early 50s, highly successful, massive egos, men who have built substantial wealth but are suddenly terrified of their own mortality and irrelevance. They are desperate for validation, and they are usually married to women who know them too well, women who remember their failures. Laurel steps in and plays the mirror. She reflects back a flawless, idealized version of the man. She makes him feel like a god, and then she starts sending the invoices." Julian leaned back, taking off his glasses. "I utilized my network over the weekend after you scheduled this consultation. I found 2 other executives in the tri-state area who retained Voss Advisory Studio over the last 5 years. Both men fit your husband's psychological profile perfectly. Both men funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars of corporate funds into her accounts under the guise of executive coaching. And in both cases, the men ended up divorced, their assets hopelessly entangled, and their personal finances critically compromised while Laurel walked away completely clean." A cold, metallic satisfaction settled in my chest. Laurel thought she was playing Everett, and Everett thought he was playing me. Neither of them realized they were just predictable variables in a mathematical equation I was already solving. "What is our immediate legal strategy?" I asked, my voice steady. "For now, we do absolutely nothing," Julian replied, a faint, predatory smile touching the corners of his mouth. "We secure all the data. We monitor the accounts. We build an airtight fortress around your personal assets. But we do not breathe a single word of this to Everett." "Let him keep digging the hole," I stated. It was not a question. "Precisely," Julian agreed. "When you are dealing with a man whose entire existence is predicated on his own perceived brilliance, an early confrontation is a tactical error. If you warn him now, he will panic. He will hire a crisis team, and he will bury the money. You must let him believe he is outsmarting you. You must let him feel invincible." I left Julian's office and walked out into the crisp Boston afternoon. The air tasted sharp and clean. I felt a profound sense of liberation wash over me. For years, I had exhausted myself trying to protect Everett from his own reckless impulses. I had acted as his shield, his safety net, his conscience. I made the decision right then, standing on the bustling sidewalk. I was going to drop the net. I returned to our penthouse that evening, greeted Everett with a warm, placid smile, and asked him how his day at the office had been. I listened to him brag about a new client acquisition, nodding at all the appropriate intervals, watching him perform his grand, arrogant play. I understood then that the most dangerous enemy is not the one who screams in your face. The most dangerous enemy is the one who helps you polish your crown while quietly measuring your neck for the guillotine. I would let Everett Dane have his victory lap. I would let him stand in front of 68 people and announce his grand, pathetic triumph, knowing that the higher he climbed the pedestal, the more devastating the impact would be when I finally shattered the floor beneath it. It began exactly 5 years before Everett stood in that private dining room and tried to erase me. During that era, Everett was entirely consumed with the physical expansion of Blackmere Strategic Group. He was obsessed with acquiring a sprawling office space, purchasing custom Italian furniture for the reception area, and hiring an expensive public relations firm to secure him prominent speaking engagements. He wanted his success to be loud, visible, and undeniably tangible. He wanted his empire to cast a massive, intimidating shadow over the Boston business district, while he was busy building monuments to his own ego. I was quietly driving across the river to Cambridge to meet with a brilliant corporate structuring attorney named Miriam Cade. Miriam was the exact opposite of the loud, aggressive litigators Everett usually kept on retainer. She was a quiet, meticulous architect of invisible corporate fortresses. Sitting in her modest, paper-filled office, I instructed her to establish a separate, fully insulated legal entity. We spent weeks drafting an ironclad operating agreement, ensuring that the corporate veil was absolutely impenetrable. We named the entity Red Alder Ventures Limited Liability Company. I funded the initial state filing fees and legal retainers using a forgotten inheritance from my late grandmother, ensuring that the seed money never touched the joint investment accounts I shared with my husband. Through Red Alder Ventures, I began offering operational strategy and business development consulting to early-stage technology startups. I was no longer interested in building companies where my name was inevitably erased from the masthead by a charismatic man. I wanted tangible ownership. That was when I was introduced to two remarkably gifted but commercially inexperienced software engineers who were trying to solve a catastrophic inefficiency in regional shipping routes. They had developed a brilliant piece of raw code, but they had absolutely no idea how to secure pilot programs, how to draft service-level agreements, or how to speak the harsh, uncompromising language of grizzled supply chain executives. We formed Harbor Grid Systems because the engineers had virtually no operating capital to pay my standard consulting rates. I proposed an alternative arrangement that would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. I offered to provide the entire operational framework, secure their first 5 enterprise clients, and build their dynamic pricing models from scratch. In exchange, Red Alder Ventures would receive a 35% equity stake in the company, fully vested upon the successful closure of our first major commercial contract. I never hid Harbor Grid Systems from my husband. I never lied to him, nor did I operate in the shadows of a grand deception. I simply understood the profound depth of his narcissism, and I weaponized his own apathy against him. One evening, over a dinner of roasted sea bass at our dining table, I casually mentioned that I had officially partnered with a new logistics technology venture. Everett barely looked up from his polished smartphone. He took a sip of his expensive red wine and smiled with a patronizing warmth that made my blood run completely cold. "That sounds wonderful, Quinn," he had said, his voice dripping with condescending approval. "I am genuinely glad you found a little logistics project to keep yourself busy while I am managing the executive board. Just ensure it does not interfere with the charity gala we are hosting next month." He did not ask for the name of the company. He did not ask to see the operating agreement. He did not inquire about my compensation structure, the market capitalization, or the cap table. To Everett, anything that did not directly feature his face or inflate his public standing was inherently small and unworthy of his intellectual curiosity. He categorized my independent work as a quaint, harmless hobby, similar to a local book club or a weekend community garden. His absolute certainty in his own superiority was the perfect, impenetrable camouflage for my ambition. Freed from his suffocating oversight, Harbor Grid Systems grew with a quiet, terrifying velocity. Our software was not glamorous. We did not build consumer applications or viral social media platforms. We built the complex, invisible neural networks that allowed massive distribution centers to communicate flawlessly with independent freight carriers. Within 14 months, our proprietary routing algorithms were adopted by 3 major warehouse networks operating across the entire Northeast corridor. Within 2 years, we had secured long-term licensing contracts with a dozen regional distributors. We operated silently in the background of the global economy, shaving critical hours off delivery times and saving our clients tens of millions of dollars in fuel and labor costs. 7 months ago, Harbor Grid Systems initiated a highly restricted closed funding round. We did not want the noisy, demanding venture capital firms of Silicon Valley. We wanted strategic institutional partners who understood heavy infrastructure. We secured a massive injection of capital that caused our internal valuation to absolutely skyrocket overnight. When Nora Kitt ran the updated financial projections through my secured server, the numbers were staggering. Red Alder Ventures held an asset that was now conservatively valued at slightly over $48 million. It was a pool of clean, heavily protected, independent wealth. It was a financial portfolio that completely dwarfed the equity value of our shared historic house in Beacon Hill, the joint investment accounts, and even the heavily leveraged valuation of Blackmere Strategic Group itself. Everett walked around Boston believing he was the undisputed king of our financial universe, completely oblivious to the fact that his discarded wife was quietly sitting on a private treasury that could easily execute a hostile cash acquisition of his entire firm. But the immense financial discrepancy was merely the foundation of the trap. The true masterpiece of this situation, the hidden tripwire that Everett was about to blindly step on, was far more poetic. 18 months ago, Blackmere Strategic Group decided they urgently needed to upgrade their proprietary client offerings to compete with the larger, global consulting firms. Everett instructed his technology director to procure a cutting-edge data analytics platform, something they could white-label and pitch to massive corporate clients as a brilliant, proprietary Blackmere innovation. They found a software vendor offering a spectacular predictive modeling tool and immediately signed a lucrative, multi-year licensing agreement. Everett aggressively championed this new tool as his ultimate competitive advantage, using it to secure his biggest clients and justify his exorbitant monthly retainer fees. He was so busy taking the public credit for the visionary acquisition that he never bothered to instruct his legal team to read the fine print of the software architecture. If he had dug just one layer deeper, he would have discovered that the vendor was merely an intermediary distributor. He would have realized that the complex predictive engine powering Blackmere's most vital consulting tool was built on an application programming interface that was exclusively owned, developed, and licensed by Harbor Grid Systems. The man who loved to boast about his strategic genius was heavily marketing a product that relied entirely on technology I controlled. Every single time he pitched a new client, every time he justified his massive fees, he was functionally subletting intellectual property from the very woman he considered a redundant background character. Under Section 7.4 of the Master Licensing Agreement, Harbor Grid retained the absolute legal right to audit the usage of that software. I held the authority to trigger a comprehensive technical review if the end user exhibited severe operational instability or engaged in unauthorized data manipulation. I held the keys to the exact engine that kept his shiny, arrogant vehicle moving forward. When I sent that single text message to Nora from the descending elevator after his grand announcement, I was not merely initiating a standard divorce proceeding. I was unlocking the armory. I had spent 5 years watching Everett construct his fragile kingdom on land that he never bothered to survey. He thought he was untouchable because he controlled the narrative in the ballroom. He thought a public humiliation would break my spirit, forcing me to quietly accept a meager settlement while he rode off into a sunset of renewed masculinity with Laurel Voss. He was tragically mistaken. By choosing to discard me in the most public, arrogant manner possible, he had unknowingly marched himself perfectly into the kill zone. He had handed me the moral and legal justification to detonate the charges I had spent years carefully placing beneath his floorboards. The financial timelines, the corporate structures, and the intellectual property rights were no longer just dormant safety nets. They were active, highly volatile instruments of destruction, and the countdown had officially reached 0. The morning sunlight filtered through the sheer curtains of our Beacon Hill kitchen, casting long, sharp shadows across the white marble island. It was exactly 6:45 in the morning. I was standing by the espresso machine, wearing a simple cashmere sweater and perfectly pressed trousers, pouring a single shot of dark roast. The house was oppressively quiet, the kind of silence that usually follows a devastating storm, but I was not standing in the wreckage. I was standing in the clear, unobstructed path I had anticipated for months. Everett walked down the hardwood stairs a few minutes past 7. He was dressed in a slate-gray tailored suit, lacking only his silk tie. He stepped into the kitchen with the careful, measured posture of a hostage negotiator stepping onto a volatile ledge. He expected shattered porcelain. He expected red, swollen eyes. He had prepared an entire arsenal of condescending apologies and pragmatic justifications designed to soothe the hysterical wife he assumed he had broken the night before. He poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning against the counter opposite me. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his meticulously styled hair. "Quinn, I know last night was highly unconventional," he began, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced octave of manufactured empathy. "But we are reasonable adults. I wanted to have this conversation in private this morning. What happened at the dinner was purely a business decision. Blackmere is at a critical juncture, and I have to make the hard choices for the survival of the firm." I took a slow sip of my espresso, letting the bitter warmth ground me. I looked at him, my expression entirely unreadable. "A business decision?" "Exactly," he said, clearly emboldened by my calm, level tone. He set his mug down and took a step closer, adopting the earnest, visionary persona he used to close reluctant investors. "Laurel brings a dynamic, aggressive energy that the board is demanding right now. We have outgrown our original operational footprint. And frankly, Quinn, you and I both know you have been disconnected from the primary workflow for over a year. You will be so much happier if you are free to focus on your own little logistics projects. You deserve the space to explore your own hobbies without the constant pressure of my corporate obligations." He was practically glowing with his own perceived benevolence. He genuinely believed he was doing me a profound favor by discarding me. He was offering me the scraps of my own dignity and expecting a gracious thank you note in return. I placed my ceramic cup gently on the marble counter. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. "You are absolutely right, Everett," I said clearly. His jaw actually slackened for a fraction of a second. The grand defensive monologue he had meticulously rehearsed died instantly in his throat. He stared at me, searching my eyes for the sarcasm, the hidden trap, the underlying hysteria. He found absolutely nothing but smooth, placid agreement. "I am," he asked, his voice betraying a flicker of genuine confusion. "Yes," I replied smoothly. "We have indeed reached the end of our shared trajectory. Blackmere requires a completely different kind of oversight now, and I have absolutely no desire to stand in the way of your new vision. A divorce is the most logical, efficient step forward for both of us. My legal counsel will contact your attorney by Tuesday morning to initiate the standard procedural filings. I assume we can handle the division of joint assets quietly and without unnecessary litigation." I watched the psychological gears grind to a halt in his head. For a man who thrived on conflict and dominance, my immediate, frictionless surrender was entirely baffling. But then, predictable as gravity, his towering narcissism took over. His brief confusion dissolved into profound relief, followed closely by a sickeningly smug satisfaction. He interpreted my icy composure as utter defeat. He assumed that because I was not screaming and fighting him for my seat at the table, I had simply accepted that I no longer deserved one. He believed I was walking away empty-handed because I had no weapons left to draw. "I am glad you are being so mature about this, Quinn," he said, a patronizing smile spreading across his handsome face. He adjusted his suit jacket, suddenly looking invincible. "It is definitely for the best. I will have my assistant send over the contact information for my legal team this afternoon. I am going to stay at the downtown penthouse for the next few weeks to give you some space to pack your things." "That sounds perfectly acceptable," I said. He turned and walked out of the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking confidently against the hardwood floor. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out the front door, stepping into the crisp morning air to accelerate his glorious new life with Laurel Voss. He left the house acting as if he had just conquered the entire world, completely unaware that he had just handed me the deed to his kingdom. The absolute second the heavy oak door clicked shut and the brass deadbolt engaged, my polite smile vanished. The charade was officially over. I walked straight to my home office, locked the heavy double doors, and opened my encrypted laptop. The time for passive observation had ended. I spent the next 4 hours systematically backing up every single shared financial document, personal tax return, and household expense ledger to an external, offline drive. I drafted a concise, legally binding email to my personal assistant, instructing her to route all future communications from Everett or anyone at Blackmere Strategic Group directly to Julian Pike. The communication blackout was now fully enforced. I would never speak directly to my husband without a lawyer present again. By 2 p.m, my encrypted messaging application chimed. It was a secure file transfer from Nora Kitt over the past 48 hours. Nora had completed the forensic tracing of every single transaction between Blackmere and Voss Advisory Studio spanning the last 24 months. She did not just send a basic spreadsheet, she sent a beautifully constructed, irrefutable narrative of corporate fraud. She had mapped the rapidly escalating payments, matching each exorbitant wire transfer with empty calendar days, vague email exchanges, and zero deliverable products. She had built a financial timeline so tightly woven that no corporate auditor or divorce judge could ever unravel it. The total sum of unauthorized capital extracted from the firm was staggering, and Nora had highlighted every single one of Everett's digital signatures authorizing the theft. 10 minutes later, a second secure file arrived. This one was from Miriam Cade. Miriam had spent the entire morning assembling the heavy artillery. The file contained the fully updated, legally certified capitalization table for Red Alder Ventures Limited Liability Company. It included the most recent valuation metrics from the highly successful closed funding round for Harbor Grid Systems. But most importantly, Miriam had attached the pristine, ironclad intellectual property licensing agreements. She had highlighted the specific clauses granting me the unilateral authority to audit, suspend, or terminate the technology permissions currently serving as the beating heart of Blackmere's most lucrative consulting product. I printed the core documents and laid them meticulously across my mahogany desk. To my left sat the undeniable proof of Everett's financial recklessness and breach of fiduciary duty. To my right sat the overwhelming proof of my independent, perfectly insulated wealth and ultimate technological leverage. I sat back in my leather chair and looked at the paper trail. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad or betrayed. I felt a cold, crystalline sense of purpose. The greatest mistake anyone can make in a war of attrition is allowing the enemy to see them bleed. Emotion is a massive liability. It simply gives the opposition a clear target to hit. I would absolutely not retaliate with tears, angry text messages, or messy public outbursts. I would do the most terrifying thing you can possibly do to a profoundly arrogant, self-satisfied man. I would give him exactly what he wanted. I would let him continue to speak loudly. I would let him parade his new consultant around the city. I would let him sign new contracts and make massive, hollow promises to his investors. I would let him climb as high as his ego could possibly take him, entirely undisturbed. And while he was busy looking at the stars, believing he had won the war without fighting a single battle, I would sit in absolute silence, preparing the cold, hard data that would soon shatter his entire reality. The atmosphere surrounding Blackmere Strategic Group shifted dramatically over the next 3 weeks, morphing from aggressive corporate ambition into a toxic, heavily curated theater production. Everett was operating at a frantic, almost manic pace. He was actively hunting a massive national logistics client, a deal so large it required him to secure a secondary round of institutional growth funding just to handle the prospective operational load. He spent his days sitting in glass-walled boardrooms with venture capitalists and private equity directors, selling them a vision of absolute market dominance. The entire foundation of his pitch, the singular trump card he played to justify his exorbitant valuation, was the proprietary predictive analytics engine. He paraded the software interface on massive screens, boasting about its processing speed and data accuracy, completely oblivious to the fact that the invisible leash attached to that technology was held firmly in my hands. Laurel Voss was no longer just a ghost hovering in the background of his calendar. She had become an aggressive, highly visible infection spreading through the executive floor. She began attending closed-door strategy meetings, sitting perfectly upright in a leather chair that did not belong to her, taking notes on a tablet, and whispering into Everett's ear before he made final decisions. She initiated a subtle but ruthless campaign to remove any legacy staff members who remembered the early days of the company, the days when my name was on the operational blueprints. She was actively transforming Blackmere into a vanity stage designed exclusively to project the manufactured image she and Everett were desperate to sell to the world. The first significant casualty of her purge was Thomas Vance. Thomas was a senior internal control director who had been meticulously managing the firm's compliance ledgers for 6 years. He was a quiet, thorough man who cared deeply about the structural integrity of the company. During a routine end-of-month reconciliation, Thomas formally flagged 4 consecutive, highly irregular invoices from Voss Advisory Studio. He sent a polite, standard internal memorandum to the executive suite, requesting a formal audit of the deliverables associated with those specific expenditures, within 48 hours of sending that email. His office was boxed up. Everett bypassed the Human Resources Department entirely and personally terminated Thomas, citing a severe misalignment of cultural vision and an inability to adapt to the new, dynamic growth phase of the firm. Security was called to escort a man who had helped build their compliance department down to the lobby in front of his peers. A cold, terrified silence instantly fell over the remaining staff. Whispers began to circulate through the break rooms and secure messaging channels, but no one dared to speak loudly. They all recognized the execution for what it was: a brutal warning that questioning the new regime, or the money funding it, was professional suicide. While Everett was busy burning down his own internal safeguards to keep his mistress comfortable, my private empire was accelerating at a pace that defied logic. Harbor Grid Systems received a highly confidential, unsolicited approach from Westfuse Mobility, one of the largest logistics technology conglomerates on the global market. They did not just want to license our routing infrastructure, they wanted to acquire the entire company outright. When Miriam Cade read the preliminary valuation numbers proposed by the Westfuse executives over a secure conference call, even her usually stoic demeanor cracked. The figure they offered was astronomical. It represented a multiplier that would instantly cement Red Alder Ventures as a titan in the silent, invisible world of deep tech investments. My 2 founding engineers were practically vibrating with excitement, ready to sign the term sheets and celebrate. I firmly instructed my partners and my legal counsel to hold the line. "We are not selling a single share right now," I told them, staring at the glowing numbers on my monitor. "Thank Westfuse for their profound interest. Tell them we are currently focused on internal scaling, and politely stall the negotiations." "Quinn, this is a generational wealth exit," one of the engineers argued, his voice tense with anxiety. "If we wait, the market could shift. They might look at a competitor." "They will not look at a competitor because there is no competitor whose code integrates as cleanly as ours," I replied, my voice completely devoid of hesitation. "You do not sell a lifeboat when the ship is securely docked at the harbor. You sell the lifeboat when the hull is breached. The alarms are screaming, and the captain is drowning. We wait. The value of our leverage is about to multiply exponentially." Parallel to the corporate maneuvers, Julian Pike was quietly weaving a masterpiece of legal destruction in the shadows. He moved with the terrifying patience of a man who hunted for a living. Julian did not simply locate the previous victims of Laurel's consulting scams. He secured ironclad, sworn affidavits from them. He gathered pristine paper trails showing exactly how she isolated older, wealthy executives, slowly siphoned their corporate accounts through vague billing practices, orchestrated the collapse of their marriages, and then vanished the second the financial scrutiny became too intense. Julian had compiled bank records, recovered deleted email chains via forensic data retrieval, and established a flawless, undeniable pattern of predatory behavior. The case against Laurel was no longer just a working theory born from a scorned wife's suspicion. It was a physical, highly weaponized binder sitting inside a fireproof steel safe in Julian's Back Bay office. As the days bled into weeks, I sat in my temporary home office, watching the data flow in from all directions. I began to realize that the three separate timelines of my life were no longer running parallel. The divorce proceedings, the impending internal collapse of Blackmir's financial integrity, and the technological kill switch held by Harbor Grid Systems were distinct missiles, but they were all locked onto the exact same coordinates. They were not going to detonate separately. They were going to collide in a spectacular, simultaneous chain reaction right at the exact moment Everett Dane truly believed he had conquered the world. The atmosphere in my daily life shifted into a relentless, suffocating countdown. Everyone around me was moving faster, breathing heavier, sprinting toward their own selfish finish lines. Everett was rushing to close his funding round. Laurel was rushing to secure her permanent position of power. The Westview's executives were rushing to acquire our technology. They were all running blind. I was the only person on the board who possessed the complete aerial map. I knew exactly where the landmines were buried. I knew precisely how much pressure was required to trigger them, and I was simply waiting for the perfect, fatal footstep. The mediation took place at exactly 10 o'clock on a crisp Thursday morning inside a neutral, aggressively modern law office located in the heart of the Back Bay. The conference room was designed to intimidate, featuring floor-to-ceiling glass walls, cold slate floors, and a massive table carved from a single slab of polished white marble. I sat on one side of the freezing stone surface with Julian Pike. Directly across from us sat Everett, flanked by a high-profile, incredibly expensive divorce attorney named Richard Vance. Richard was a man famous throughout the city for his custom Italian suits and his brutal, bullying tactics in family court. Everett looked profoundly bored. He wore a tailored navy blue suit and checked his platinum wristwatch twice before anyone even opened a single folder. To him, this room was nothing more than a minor, irritating administrative hurdle on his grand highway to absolute freedom. He sat with his legs crossed, projecting the relaxed, untouchable aura of a man who firmly believed he held every single advantage on the board. He had come here to negotiate terms with a broken woman. Richard opened the session by sliding forward a thin, neatly bound portfolio. It contained the highly predictable inventory of our shared, superficial existence. There was the deed to the historic house in Beacon Hill, the paperwork for the 2 luxury vehicles we leased, the joint checking accounts, and the standard, moderately performing investment portfolios we had established together during our first few years of marriage. Richard read through the total assets with a dismissive, rapid cadence. Everett nodded along, occasionally glancing down at his phone under the table. He clearly expected me to fight for a slightly larger percentage of the house equity or to aggressively demand a generous monthly alimony package. He was mentally prepared to toss me a comfortable financial bone just to make me go away quietly and permanently. Julian let Richard finish his entire, arrogant monologue. My attorney did not interrupt, did not object, and did not betray a single human emotion. He simply waited, his hands folded neatly in front of him, until the air in the room settled into a thick, suffocating silence. "Are we in agreement on the baseline marital assets, Mr. Pike?" Richard asked, steepling his fingers and leaning forward. "My client is prepared to be quite generous regarding the primary residence in order to expedite this overall process. We want this transition to be as smooth as possible for everyone involved." Julian slowly unclasped the brass locks of his leather briefcase. "The baseline joint assets are perfectly accurate, Richard," Julian replied, his voice a low, soothing hum. "However, our financial disclosures are currently incomplete. We need to officially introduce the independent asset portfolio belonging exclusively to my client." Everett let out a short, highly patronizing laugh. He shook his head. "Quinn's independent portfolio?" Everett asked, looking at Richard with an amused smirk. "What, her little consulting projects, Richard? Let her keep whatever pocket change she made from her logistics hobby. We do not need to fight over pennies. I do not care about it." Julian ignored Everett completely. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, heavy, wire-bound document. He set it directly in the center of the marble table. The thud it made against the stone was remarkably solid, echoing loudly in the quiet room. "This is the corporate charter and the fully audited, legally certified capitalization table for Red Alder Ventures Limited Liability Company, Julian stated, his voice smooth and cold as ice. Established exactly 5 years and 2 months ago, funded entirely through non-marital inheritance capital, and legally insulated from the joint marital estate by airtight corporate structuring. Richard frowned slightly, pulling the heavy document toward his side of the table. He flipped open the thick cover. Everett continued to look profoundly bored, though a tiny, microscopic furrow appeared between his eyebrows. Red Alder Ventures holds a 35% equity stake in a private technology firm known as Harbor Grid Systems, Julian continued, speaking with deliberate, terrifying precision. Included in that packet is the independent valuation report finalized less than 3 weeks ago, following a highly successful closed institutional funding round. The current, highly conservative valuation of my client's personal equity is approximately $48 million. The entire room froze. The arrogant, condescending smirk vanished from Everett's handsome face as if it had been physically wiped away by a violent hand. He lunged forward in his leather chair, his eyes darting wildly to the page Richard was frantically reading. $48 million, Everett repeated. His voice was barely a whisper. It was not a question. It was the hollow sound of a man trying to process a mathematical reality that fundamentally shattered his entire understanding of the universe. Furthermore, Julian said, refusing to allow them a single second to recover their breath, my client does not simply hold illiquid equity. Red Alder Ventures receives a direct, continuous revenue stream from several proprietary software licensing agreements. Additionally, her foundational shares possess attached legal rights guaranteeing a massive multiplier payout upon the execution of their next major strategic acquisition. I will note for the record that an acquisition event is currently in late-stage negotiations with a global conglomerate. Richard's face had drained of all its aggressive, courtroom color. He was an incredibly experienced, cutthroat corporate lawyer, and he instantly recognized the flawless, impenetrable legal architecture Miriam Cade had constructed on my behalf. He knew immediately, just by glancing at the ownership structures, that Everett had absolutely no legal claim to a single penny of that wealth. Everett, did you know about the existence of this entity? Richard snapped, completely abandoning his smooth, professional demeanor. He glared at his client. She said she did some consulting. Everett stammered, turning his head slowly to stare at me. He was not looking at the woman he had publicly discarded at a corporate dinner party. He was staring at an absolute stranger. I thought it was a small freelance thing, Everett whispered, genuine panic finally bleeding into his tone. A side project. You never asked, I said, breaking my silence for the first time since we entered the room. My voice was completely calm, steady, and devoid of any vindictive joy. You never asked to read the contracts. You never requested to see a balance sheet. You never found my work important enough to investigate. Everett. Julian was not finished. He turned a page in his own copy of the heavy binder. He was meticulously preparing to deliver the final, lethal strike. There is one final, rather urgent matter regarding the licensing revenue, Julian noted, pushing a specifically highlighted sheet of paper across the smooth marble table toward Richard. One of the primary licensing contracts generating monthly revenue for Harbor Grid Systems is a master agreement with a third-party software distributor. That specific distributor licenses a highly advanced proprietary predictive analytics engine. Richard scanned the highlighted paragraph. His eyes widened slightly. He looked up at Everett, then back down at the paper, his jaw tightening. Everett, Richard said, his tone turning remarkably grim and urgent. What is the exact name of the core analytics platform Blackmere is currently pitching to secure your new national client and your upcoming growth funding? The Apex Predictor. Everett answered automatically, though the color was now rapidly draining from his own face. We white-labeled it for our exclusive use. It is the cornerstone of our entire growth pitch for the next fiscal year. Why? Richard slid the highlighted paper directly toward his client. Because the underlying application programming interface for your cornerstone product is exclusively owned, developed, and licensed by Harbor Grid Systems, Richard explained, his voice flat and defeated. Your wife's company. Everett stared blankly at the paper. His chest stopped moving entirely. I draw your immediate attention to Section 7.4 of that specific licensing agreement, Julian added softly. Twisting the knife with absolute professional grace, Harbor Grid Systems retains the absolute, unilateral right to initiate a comprehensive technical review and potentially suspend all operational access if they detect severe structural instability, financial irregularities, or unauthorized usage patterns by the end user, which in this specific case is Blackmir's strategic group. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. It was the sound of a massive, invisible empire collapsing perfectly in on itself. In that sterile conference room, the entire power dynamic of our decade-long relationship violently inverted. Everett suddenly realized he had spent the last 5 years treating me like an obsolete, burdensome piece of furniture, completely blind to the fact that I had quietly purchased the entire building he was standing in. He had walked into this mediation expecting to graciously allow me to keep my leased car and a fraction of my dignity. Instead, he discovered that I was a multimillionaire who held the absolute, legal authority to unplug the exact technology keeping his firm alive during its most critical, vulnerable fundraising phase. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the very first time in years. His eyes were wide with a horrifying, crushing realization. He finally saw the cold, calculated patience it took for me to sit across from him at breakfast for years. He saw the terrifying discipline it took to let him talk over me in meetings, to let him claim my operational successes as his own genius, and to let him parade his mistress around our city. All while I calmly held the remote control to his explosive vest. Richard abruptly closed the heavy binder and stood up from his chair. Mr. Pike, given these entirely unforeseen and highly complex corporate disclosures, we are going to need to pause this mediation immediately, Richard stated, packing his leather briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. I need to confer with my client regarding the severe business implications of these documents. Take absolutely all the time you need, Richard, Julian replied smoothly, remaining perfectly still in his seat. Everett did not move. He sat completely frozen in his expensive chair, his hands gripping the edge of the cold marble table so tightly that his knuckles were stark white. I stood up, smoothed the front of my tailored blazer, and picked up my leather bag. I did not offer a final, gloating remark. I did not need to smile or sneer. The printed numbers sitting on the table were infinitely louder and more devastating than anything I could ever possibly say. I simply turned and walked out of the glass-walled room, leaving him completely trapped in the terrifying, inescapable wreckage of his own arrogance. The shockwave from the Back Bay mediation room did not dissipate. It crystallized into a highly coordinated, multi-front legal assault. Less than 48 hours after Richard Vance practically dragged my husband out of the conference room, Julian Pike executed the next phase of our strategy. Julian did not leak anything to the press. He did something infinitely more damaging. He formally transmitted our heavily documented, expanded dossier regarding Voss Advisory Studio to the legal teams representing the 2 previous executives Laurel had financially drained. By providing those attorneys with the missing connective tissue, the identical billing patterns, the matching fraudulent invoice descriptions, and the undeniable timeline of emotional manipulation, Julian essentially handed them the keys to reopen their dormant civil fraud cases. Overnight, the legal pressure surrounding Laurel transformed from a localized threat into a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional nightmare. Subpoenas for her banking records, corporate communications, and personal devices were immediately filed. Everett, living in his newly leased downtown penthouse, genuinely believed that Laurel would stand beside him in the trenches. He thought they were partners in a grand, modern romance, fighting against the bitter, obsolete wife who was trying to tear them down. He severely underestimated the survival instincts of a professional parasite. The moment the threat of a federal wire fraud investigation began to materialize, Laurel dropped the supportive, visionary facade entirely. She went into aggressive self-preservation mode. When the initial inquiries from Blackmure's nervous legal department reached her inbox, she did not defend their joint decisions. Instead, she drafted a scathing, highly formalized response claiming that she was merely an independent contractor executing the explicit, demanding directives of the chief executive officer. She threw Everett directly into the fire, stating on the official corporate record that he was the one who had proactively initiated the exorbitant payments, unilaterally approved the vague invoices, and continuously demanded her presence at strategic meetings against her professional advice. She painted herself as a victim of a powerful, obsessed executive who used company funds to forcefully court her. Her betrayal completely shattered Everett, but the fatal blow came during the mandatory discovery phase of our divorce proceedings. To establish the precise timeline of the marital asset dissipation, Julian legally compelled the extraction of all electronic communications between my husband and his consultant. The recovered text messages were not the poetic, passionate exchanges of two star-crossed lovers. They were a chilling, clinical transcript of psychological manipulation and calculated corporate sabotage. The board of directors at Blackmure Strategic Group was legally obligated to review a redacted batch of these messages due to the massive misuse of company funds. What they read horrified them. Laurel had actively coached Everett on how to isolate me. She sent messages instructing him to cut my access to the operational drives. She promised him unparalleled industry dominance if he simply eliminated the dead weight from his executive suite. One particularly damning exchange, time-stamped exactly 4 days before he approved a wire transfer for $50,000, featured Laurel telling him that true visionary leaders do not ask permission from their wives to reallocate growth capital. Everett's responses were pathetic. Desperate attempts to prove his masculinity and unquestioned authority by immediately transferring the money under fraudulent billing codes. Faced with undeniable evidence of a compromised chief executive, the Blackmure Executive Board panicked. They were in the middle of securing a massive national client and a secondary funding round. The absolute last thing they could afford was a scandal involving embezzled funds, a fraudulent consultant, and a catastrophic failure of corporate governance. The board convened an emergency, closed-door session on a Friday evening. By Monday morning, they formally launched a sweeping internal review of all executive expenditures. They immediately suspended Everett's unilateral spending authority, freezing his corporate cards and requiring dual signatures from the chief financial officer for any operational decision. The physical environment of Blackmure began to violently reject him, with the protective aura of his untouchable authority shattered. The terrified silence among the staff finally broke. The veteran managers, the ones who had survived Laurel's ruthless purge, were called into private interviews with the board's independent auditors. Freed from the fear of immediate termination, they started telling the absolute truth. Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer, sat in front of the board and explicitly dismantled Everett's grand mythology. Marcus provided original, time-stamped digital files proving that I was the sole architect of the firm's foundational operational models. Other senior directors testified that while Everett was brilliant at delivering a pitch on a brightly lit stage, he had virtually no understanding of the underlying data structures. They confessed that the company had been running on the fumes of my legacy systems for over a year, and that Laurel's so-called strategic presence optimization had actually caused a severe degradation in their internal workflow. Everett was rapidly losing control of his narrative, his company, and his entire reality. The walls were closing in, and the polished, arrogant CEO was disintegrating into a cornered, panicked animal. Late on a Tuesday evening, my secure phone vibrated on the marble kitchen island. The caller identification displayed a restricted number, but I knew exactly who it was. I had maintained a strict, impenetrable communication blackout for weeks, refusing to answer any emails or direct messages. I let it ring 4 times before I calmly pressed the green icon and held the device to my ear. I did not say hello. "Quinn!" Everett's voice crackled through the speaker. He sounded hollow, exhausted, and incredibly small. It was a voice stripped entirely of its booming baritone confidence. "Please do not hang up." I remained perfectly silent, listening to his ragged breathing. "You have to call off your lawyer," Everett pleaded, his words stumbling over each other in a frantic rush. "You have to stop this. The board is auditing every single decision I have made for the last 2 years. Laurel is lying to their legal counsel, claiming I forced the payments on her. The national client is threatening to pull out of the negotiations because they heard rumors about a structural review of our analytics software. You are destroying everything we built." "I have not destroyed a single thing, Everett," I replied, my voice as smooth and cold as a frozen lake. "I simply provided the board with the correct accounting ledgers." "You made this a war," he suddenly shouted, a brief, pathetic flare of his old arrogance breaking through the panic. "This was supposed to be a private separation. You turned a personal matter into a corporate execution. You set a trap for me." "I did not set a trap," I corrected him, measuring every single syllable. "I simply stopped functioning as your safety net. You leaped off the ledge entirely on your own. I just allowed gravity to do its natural work. Quinn, please." He shifted back to begging, his voice cracking. "I can fix this. We can negotiate a massive settlement. I will give you whatever percentage of the house you want. Just tell Harbor Grid Systems to issue a public statement affirming the stability of our licensing agreement if they pull the technology. Blackmere is completely bankrupt. I will lose the firm." He was still trying to bargain with chips he no longer possessed. He still fundamentally misunderstood the geometry of the battlefield. He thought we were negotiating a ceasefire, completely oblivious to the fact that the war had already ended the moment he stood up in that dining room and announced my replacement. "Any requests regarding the Harbor Grid Systems licensing agreement must be submitted in writing to their corporate counsel," I stated flawlessly, quoting the exact legal protocol Miriam Cade had established. "I do not interfere with their independent board decisions. Goodbye, Everett." I ended the call before he could utter another desperate syllable. I immediately blocked the restricted number and forwarded the exact timestamp and duration of the call to Julian Pike for our legal records. I did not feel a rush of vindictive adrenaline. I did not feel the need to gloat or celebrate his suffering. I simply felt an overwhelming sense of clinical efficiency. I had spent years managing his crises, soothing his ego, and cleaning up his reckless mistakes. Now, I was completely detached from the chaotic blast radius of his collapsing life. The narrative had completely shifted. Laurel was scrambling to save herself from federal scrutiny. Everett was trapped in a boardroom, desperately trying to justify his fraudulent expenses to a group of furious investors. The empire he loved to boast about was actively burning to the ground, and the flames were entirely fueled by his own arrogance. As the siege around Blackmere tightened, I found myself needing to appear less and less. I did not need to raise my voice or stand in the center of the room anymore. The trap was perfectly constructed. The doors were permanently locked, and I was simply watching the inevitable, mathematical conclusion unfold from a very safe, very quiet distance. The frantic, chaotic energy of Everett Dane's downward spiral manifested in a desperate legal maneuver exactly 48 hours after our catastrophic mediation session. Julian Pike called me on a Tuesday morning, his voice maintaining its usual, unnerving calm as he relayed a formal settlement proposal from Richard Vance. Everett was attempting to buy his way out of the burning building he had set on fire. The offer was staggering in its sheer, panicked generosity. He proposed signing over the Beacon Hill house in its entirety, relinquishing all claims to our joint investment accounts, and providing a lump sum cash concession of $3 million. There was, of course, a singular, massive condition attached to this sudden wealth transfer. I had to personally guarantee that Harbor Grid Systems would immediately issue a formal letter of operational stability to the Blackmere Strategic Group Executive Board, explicitly halting any impending technical audits or licensing reviews of the analytics platform. He was trying to bribe me with my own marital assets to save his corporate skin. I sat in my home office, looking out the window at the quiet, cobblestone street, and felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical clarity. I did not laugh, and I did not indulge in a dramatic, vindictive refusal. I simply gave Julian a direct, emotionless instruction. Draft a single paragraph response. Julian, I said, my voice perfectly steady. Inform Mr. Vance that all corporate matters concerning Harbor Grid systems are strictly bound by fiduciary duty, established governance protocols, and the existing licensing contracts. I will not personally interfere with, nor manipulate, a legally mandated corporate review outside the parameters of those agreements. Tell him the divorce settlement will be negotiated entirely separate from his professional liabilities. Everett was still trying to play a game of emotional leverage, completely failing to grasp that the game board had been locked away and replaced by a courtroom. I was not going to save him. But more importantly, I was not going to break the law or compromise my own company's integrity just to punish him. I was simply going to let the ironclad contracts he had signed do exactly what they were designed to do. The following afternoon, the board of directors for Harbor Grid Systems convened in a highly secure, encrypted virtual conference room. It was not a meeting driven by marital vengeance. It was a necessary, rigorous evaluation of extreme vendor risk. My two engineering partners, Miriam Cade, and I systematically reviewed the master licensing agreement currently binding us to Blackmere. We focused specifically on Section 9, subsection B, which explicitly outlined the licensee's obligation to maintain absolute financial transparency and operational stability. The undeniable fact was that Blackmere was currently undergoing a massive internal audit triggered by severe financial irregularities and the embezzlement of corporate funds through Voss Advisory Studio. Their chief executive officer was actively compromised. This represented a critical, unacceptable vulnerability to our proprietary technology. We could not allow our core application programming interface to be utilized by an unstable entity currently under investigation for fraudulent accounting. We are not pulling the plug arbitrarily, I told the board, looking at the grim faces of my partners on the digital grid. We are simply executing our legal right to protect our intellectual property from a deeply contaminated ecosystem. Blackmere has breached the risk threshold. We must activate the formal review. We took an official vote. It was completely unanimous. The legal counsel for Harbor Grid Systems immediately drafted the formal notice, explicitly demanding a comprehensive technical and compliance audit of Blackmere's usage of our software. Until the audit was completed and the risk was entirely mitigated, Blackmere was legally prohibited from utilizing the analytics platform in any new commercial pitches or client acquisitions. The delivery of that notice was a masterpiece of unavoidable, devastating timing. It was exactly 9:45 on a Thursday morning. Everett was standing inside the primary glass-walled boardroom of his high-rise office in the Seaport District. He was exactly 15 minutes away from initiating the most critical, high-stakes presentation of his entire professional career. A group of heavily capitalized national logistics partners were currently sitting in the lobby, waiting to be escorted in. Everett had promised his internal board that this specific deal would propel Blackmere into a completely new stratosphere of global influence. He was straightening his custom silk tie, mentally rehearsing his charismatic opening lines, and preparing to showcase the Apex Predictor as the ultimate, unbeatable weapon in their consulting arsenal. His encrypted tablet, resting on the polished mahogany table, chimed sharply. It was the formal legal notice from Harbor Grid Systems. As he read the sterile, uncompromising legal jargon, the blood vanished from his face. The notice explicitly stripped him of the legal right to present the very technology his entire, multi-million-dollar pitch was constructed around. If he turned on the screen and showed those investors the software, he would be committing a massive, documented breach of contract that would bankrupt his firm in legal damages before the sun went down. But the universe, having finally caught up with his arrogance, was not finished with him. While he was standing in the boardroom, staring in pure horror at the digital death warrant on his tablet, a secondary, entirely separate shockwave violently struck the firm. Major financial news outlets and regional legal blogs simultaneously broke the story that a sweeping multi-plaintiff civil lawsuit had just been formally filed in district court against Laurel Voss and Voss Advisory Studio. Julian Pike's meticulous, quiet intelligence gathering had birthed an absolute monster. The lawsuit detailed a highly sophisticated pattern of predatory financial extraction, naming 4 separate, ruined executives as plaintiffs. The catastrophic detail for Everett was that the public court filings explicitly named Blackmere Strategic Group in the primary discovery demands. The legal documents requested a full, unredacted accounting of the hundreds of thousands of dollars Everett had unilaterally funneled into her shell company. The dark, pathetic secret of his purchased affair was violently dragged out of the prestigious shadows and thrown directly into the harsh, humiliating fluorescent light of a public corporate fraud scandal. The executive committee of Blackmere did not even wait for his national pitch to inevitably collapse. They saw the news alerts hitting their phones, and they reacted with the ruthless, terrifying speed of men trying to save their own wealth. Before the prospective clients were even offered a cup of coffee in the lobby, the senior executive board marched directly into the glass boardroom. Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer who had quietly witnessed Everett steal the credit for my operational models for years, walked straight up to my husband. Marcus did not look intimidated. He looked profoundly disgusted. Marcus handed Everett a single, heavily stamped sheet of paper. It was an emergency, legally binding resolution passed by the board of directors just 3 minutes prior. Effective immediately, Everett Dane was officially stripped of all unilateral financial, operational, and administrative authority within the company he had founded. His corporate credit accounts were permanently frozen. He was legally barred from signing a single check, authorizing a new hire, or approving any client proposals without the explicit, physically signed consent of a 3-person oversight committee. He was no longer permitted to speak to the press, and he was instructed to clear his schedule to face a team of external forensic auditors. For the very first time in his charmed, arrogant life, Everett was not being treated as a visionary leader, a charismatic genius, or the smartest man in the room. He was being treated exactly like a highly toxic, rapidly depreciating asset that needed to be aggressively quarantined before it poisoned the entire portfolio. He stood alone in the center of the massive, silent boardroom. He held the useless presentation remote in his right hand and the humiliating board resolution in his left. He looked out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Boston skyline he had always believed he conquered. It was in that precise, agonizing moment of total paralysis that Everett finally understood the geometry of his own destruction. He realized that the grand, theatrical dinner party weeks ago, the moment he had proudly raised a glass of expensive champagne and confidently declared me an obsolete chapter of his past, was not his ultimate, glorious victory. It was the exact, undeniable moment he had gleefully pressed the launch button for his own spectacular annihilation. The absolute destruction of a corporate titan does not happen with a cinematic explosion. It happens in a suffocatingly quiet room accompanied by the gentle shuffling of legal documents. The ultimate climax of Everett's manufactured reality took place inside the primary boardroom of Blackmere Strategic Group on a Friday morning. It was an emergency summit convened by the executive board, their corporate defense attorneys, and the incredibly nervous funding partners from the national logistics firm who were supposed to be the crown jewel of Everett's career. I was not in the room, but I did not need to be. Julian Pike sat quietly in the corner as an observing party to the intellectual property dispute, and he recounted every single agonizing second to me later. Everett sat at the head of the long mahogany table, but he was a king without a crown. He was visibly exhausted, his perfectly tailored suit looking suddenly hollow around his shoulders. Across from him sat the lead representative of the National Funding Syndicate, a ruthless risk assessment executive who did not care about charisma or visionary speeches. He only cared about liability. The investors demanded immediate, unquestionable answers to 3 distinct, catastrophic problems that had surfaced over the last 72 hours. First, they required a full explanation for the hundreds of thousands of dollars covertly funneled to Laurel Voss. Second, They demanded to know why the internal growth projections presented in their prospectus did not match the newly discovered forensic audit. Finally, and most devastatingly, they wanted an explanation regarding the legal notice from Harbor Grid Systems, which explicitly threatened to revoke access to the core analytics platform due to a breach of trust. Everett tried to do what he had always done. He tried to charm his way out of a burning building. He leaned forward, attempting to project the alpha masculine energy Laurel had convinced him he possessed. "Gentlemen, we are facing a temporary administrative hurdle," Everett pleaded, his voice carrying a desperate, vibrating edge. "The situation with the consultant was a regrettable oversight, but she has been entirely removed from our ecosystem. As the founder and chief executive of this firm, I can personally guarantee that our growth trajectory remains secure. We built this company from the ground up, and we have absolute control over our technological assets." It was a beautiful, desperate lie, and for the very first time in his life, absolutely no one believed him. The lead investor did not even look at him. He simply turned to Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer of Blackmere. Marcus did not hesitate. He slid a thick stack of printed emails, bank transfer authorizations, and the master licensing agreement directly across the table. "The analytics engine you pitched to us as a proprietary weapon is entirely owned by a third party," the lead investor stated, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he reviewed the licensing contract. "A third party that is currently placing this firm under a hostile technical review due to your fraudulent financial behavior. You do not own the technology, Everett. You are merely renting it, and your landlord is about to evict you." Everett stammered, frantically trying to shift the blame. "Laurel Voss manipulated those invoices. She bypassed our internal protocols. I was misled." Marcus immediately pushed another piece of paper forward. "Every single wire transfer to Voss Advisory Studio bears your direct digital signature. Everett, you authorize the funds. You actively suppress the internal compliance reports. The documentation is absolute." The illusion shattered completely. The investors realized that the magnificent visionary founder they were about to give millions of dollars to was nothing more than a compromised, reckless liability standing on a stage built entirely by someone else. The lead investor closed his leather portfolio with a sharp, definitive snap. "We do not invest capital into actively collapsing infrastructure," the investor announced, standing up from his chair. "This acquisition is permanently frozen, and all funding negotiations are immediately terminated. Good luck with your federal audits. Gentlemen," as the investors walked out of the glass doors, taking the entire future of Blackmere Strategic Group with them, Everett collapsed back into his chair. He was surrounded by his own board members, who were already pulling out their phones to contact bankruptcy restructuring firms. Every word he had spoken was neutralized by a contract, an email, or his own undeniable signature. He was finally trapped in a reality where his charisma possessed zero currency. While Everett was drowning in the boardroom, my own legal extraction was remarkably swift and perfectly clean. Faced with the overwhelming threat of the Harbor Grid Systems audit and the total collapse of his financial leverage, Richard Vance unconditionally surrendered on behalf of his client. The divorce settlement was finalized exactly according to our terms. I retained absolute, 100% ownership of Red Alder Ventures Limited Liability Company, my entire equity stake in Harbor Grid Systems, and every single intellectual property right associated with my past and future work. I walked away completely untouched. Everett retained his controlling stake in Blackmere, but his grand prize was now a heavily besieged, rapidly depreciating asset drowning in civil litigation, forensic investigations, and shattered industry trust. 3 weeks after his empire crumbled, mine ascended, because Harbor Grid Systems was no longer tethered to the toxic, unstable environment of Blackmere. Our risk profile improved dramatically. We returned to the negotiating table with Westviews Mobility holding maximum leverage, without Everett's shadow darkening our data integrity. My engineering partners and I secured a massive strategic partnership agreement. The final valuation was significantly higher than their initial offer, cementing my financial independence for the rest of my life. I did not celebrate by throwing a lavish party or buying an ostentatious penthouse to rival the one Everett had rented for his mistress. True power does not need to announce itself. Instead, I purchased a beautifully renovated, historic brick house on a quiet, tree-lined street in Charlestown. The neighborhood was peaceful, smelling of salty ocean air and old cobblestones. I furnished the space exactly the way I wanted it, filling it with warm leather, dark wood, and an incredible high-end Italian espresso machine that hummed perfectly every morning. I adopted a sweet, incredibly loyal rescue dog, a golden mix I named Marlowe, who spent his afternoons sleeping happily in the sun patches on my living room floor. I returned to working full-time on my own terms, consulting for brilliant founders who actually respected the silent, foundational architecture of their businesses. The final chapter of this story does not feature me standing in front of Everett Dane, gloating over his ruin or demanding an apology he is incapable of giving. Revenge, I learned, is not about destroying the other person. It is about completely reclaiming your own narrative. It happened on a crisp Tuesday morning. I was sitting at my rustic kitchen table, holding a warm ceramic mug of dark roast coffee, with Marlowe resting his heavy head gently on my feet. My laptop screen glowed brightly, displaying the official, legally binding closing documents for the West Fuse Mobility acquisition. The numbers on the screen represented a lifetime of security, built entirely by my own hands and my own intellect. I looked out the window at the quiet street, and for a fleeting moment, I remembered that extravagant dinner party in the Seaport district. I remembered the 68 people, the smell of expensive champagne, and the profound arrogance in Everett's voice when he declared that I was just a piece of his past he was leaving behind. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. It was a genuine, quiet smile of absolute peace. He was right about one thing that night: we were definitely moving in different directions. He had marched straight into his own meticulously crafted cage, and I had simply walked out the front door. The absolute greatest victory was not watching him fall. It was the quiet, undeniable realization that the person writing the next chapter of my life was no longer Everett Dane. It was me. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below letting me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Olivia Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by hitting that hype button so this story can reach and inspire even more people.